A very good evening, everyone. We welcome you to today's discussion on the making of Bangladesh 50 years on. The emergence of an independent Bangladesh in 1971 was a pivotal event in the history of contemporary South Asia. 50 years on, it is increasingly clear that it was also a watershed moment in the global history of the late 20th century. Today's conversation will look back at the turbulent and often contested events of those intense 9 months of 1971, focusing on the political processes and personalities, the calculations, the risks, and the diplomatic choices that shaped this extraordinary crisis and its consequences, both intended and unintended, which we see unfolding even today. We have here with us two preeminent figures from two quite different fields of knowledge and experience, whose diverse insights and perspectives promise to enrich this discussion and debate on one of the most defining conflicts of the last century, as well as on contemporary historiography. A very warm welcome to both of you, Mr. Mahfuz Anam and Professor Srinath Raghavan. We are honored and delighted to have you here with us today. Mahfuz Anam is co-founder, editor and publisher of the Daily Star, the largest circulating, most quoted and trusted English newspaper in Bangladesh today. Since its inception in 1991, he has pursued a vigorous editorial policy in favor of democracy, freedom of expression, media and fundamental rights. An active participant in the 1971 Liberation War of Bangladesh, he has also worked with UNESCO from 1977 to 1990 in various public affairs and media capacities. He was awarded the Jefferson Fellowship in Journalism by the East West Center, Honolulu. With a career in journalism spanning almost 50 years, he is a respected and very well known public figure and television personality and has also contributed regularly for Indian dailies like the Indian Express. Srinath Raghavan is Professor of International Relations and History at Ashoka University, Delhi. He has previously taught at King's College London and worked at the Centre for Policy Research, Delhi. He has authored several books, including a major critically acclaimed work on the 1971 War of Independence. A former member of the National Security Advisory Board and chief editor of the Kargil War History for the Ministry of Defense, Government of India, before entering academia, he also served the Indian Army for 6 years as an infantry officer. He is a recipient of the K. Subramaniam Award for Strategic Studies and the Infosys Prize for Social Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Raghavan and Mr. Anam. And over to you.
Thank you for inviting us. We are delighted to be in this program. Um, I think, Srinath, you're going to go first.
Well, I just wanted to begin by thanking William Blackstone for putting us in this conversation. Because when I was doing research for this book in Dhaka, I didn't have the fortune of meeting you. But it's very nice to connect, even though at this very opportune moment, just 50 years of the Bangladesh independence war. And when I was writing that book, one of the sort of key questions that I had in my mind was how to situate the liberation struggle of Bangladesh within a broader sort of regional and global context. And that's what the book really is about. And in some ways, one of the very fair criticisms that I've got is that in some ways the book doesn't focus that much on what the Bangladeshis themselves did in terms of the liberation. But as I said, my main attempt was to focus on that. And perhaps, Mr. Anand, that might be a good starting point also to just talk about what I thought were the bigger forces that shaped the emergence of Bangladesh in 1970. And in the book, I argued that there were three broad processes, all of which were international or global, which coincided around the time of 1971 and in many ways shaped the way that particular crisis played. The three were really, it was a very important moment in the Cold War. It was an important moment in decolonization. And we were witnessing the beginnings of what would later come to be called as globalization. Now, let me just very quickly sort of tackle each of these and then sort of move on. So when I say it was a very interesting moment in the Cold War, what I meant was that the late 1960s is the time when the rigid polarity of Cold War, as structured around two camps, one led by the Soviet Union, the other by the United States, was getting shaken up, and the geometry of the Cold War was changing. On the Soviet Union side, of course, we know that the most important development was the Sino-Soviet split. In 1969, China and Pakistan were literally at blows. China and Soviet Union were literally at blows with each other, and that created a new kind of opening between the United States and China, which actually coincided smack in the middle of the 1970s. But we should also remember that the similar processes were operating on the United States' side as well. The United States and its European allies were also coming apart, even as the Cold War was progressing. This is a period when Willy Brandt had become Chancellor of West Germany. He was taking an attempt to sort of create a détente with East Germany. All of that meant that, important players like West Germany, France, or Britain actually took positions which would be at somewhat variance with those of the United States. They were not simply willing to fall in line and accept what the United States was willing to say or what the Nixon administration's line. So in a very real sense, the Cold War and its kind of unspooling at this particular moment, I think, was very crucial in the way that the crisis itself played out. And we can talk in greater detail about that. The second thing, as I said, is about decolonization. Now, decolonization, of course, there's a first wave of decolonization after the Second World War. But it's only from the late 1950s, 59 onwards, that we see that there is a rapid spurt of decolonization, and there is an emergence of a number of countries from erstwhile colonial rule. Now, this means that the international system, and particularly the composition of the UN General Assembly, by the time we're talking about 1970, is starting to look very different from what it was in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and that too, I think, had important implications. Now, in some ways, you could even look at the case of what was happening in United Pakistan in the late 1960s as exemplary of the broader trend of many of the decolonizing societies. Pakistan had fallen under military rule. It was increasingly authoritarian, centered around one personality, which then led to various kinds of demands by other groups for independence. And of course, the closest parallel, which I can indicate in the book, is between Biafra, which was a province of Nigeria, which sought to gain independence, which happened just literally a couple of years before the Bangladesh liberation. Of course, the Biafran War did not succeed, but it still set an important template. And the third, and in some ways the least understood, I think, still of the processes which shaped the emergence of Bangladesh in 1971, is the beginning of what we would later come to call globalization, by which I mean a greater interconnection between different parts of the world because of changes in technology such as air travel, the advent of satellite television, which made it possible for people to observe almost in real term the social processes that were happening in different parts of the world, and for them to get replicated in other parts of the world. Now, I would imagine that the 1968-69 student movement in Pakistan, which led to the overthrow of the Ayub Khan regime, was very much part of the broader student revolts of 1968. We know a lot about the Western cases, but we don't understand how the Western cases are not isolated, but part of a larger global movement, in which the Pakistan case was also there. And in some ways, I would argue that the student movement in Pakistan was perhaps among the more successful, in as much as it actually managed to overthrow an authoritarian military dictatorship in Pakistan. Of course, it led to its replacement by another military for a short period before the emergence of Bangladesh. But Mr. Anam, you were of course there as a student, and activist at that time. So maybe you should tell us a little bit about what it felt like to be there and what the view from the ground up was.
Thank you. I think you've brought in beautifully the global perspective. So I will focus on the internal dynamics of the whole process. Now, many of you perhaps may not be fully aware. The 1971 liberation war of Bangladesh was a long time in making. Now, we all remember the history of the partition of 1947, in which Bengal was partitioned in the east and Punjab was partitioned in the west. Now, in partitioning Bengal, we were made a part of a state called Pakistan. And it was mostly based on a religious identity. Now, interestingly, this is a very interesting, if you like, part of history, that it was the Muslim Bengalis who in a sense spearheaded or legitimized the demand for Pakistan. I mean, it's always given to Jinnah and the Muslim League and thought of as something that happened in central India or in the western part of the subcontinent. But it was actually in the East. Bengali Muslims first time voted en masse in support of Pakistan. And it can be said that Pakistan got its legitimization in terms of people's support in the East. Now, this is 47. Bengali Muslims come together and vote overwhelmingly for Pakistan. And then 23 years later, it is again, I mean, Bengali Muslims, the majority people were Muslims in this part of Bengal. We have, of course, parts of large numbers of Hindus, Christians, and Buddhists. But it is the majority citizens here who voted for Pakistan in 47, dismantled Pakistan in 1971 within a matter of 23 years. I think it's a very rare instance in history where people, in a way, make history, and within 23 years, they unmake that history. It is the same people who voted for Pakistan, dismantled Pakistan. And the process that happened from 1947 to 71 was a process that I would call delegitimization of Pakistan, in the eyes of the Bengalis at least. And this delegitimization took place first on the issue of language. In 1952, Pakistan and its founder, Mr. Jinnah, made a very proud statement in his only visit to East Pakistan at that time, and declaring that Urdu shall be the only national language Pakistan. Now, if you want to dramatize history, and if you want to put a moment in which the whole set of events get triggered, then you can say this is the speech of Jinnah that broke Pakistan just at the time when he was trying to consolidate it. He comes to East Pakistan in 1947. His only visit, as you know, within a few months, he unfortunately passes away. So here he comes, father of Pakistan, quote unquote, and sows the seed of dismantling the very country that he has worked so hard to create. So 47, the national movement language movement starts, and it acquires a crescendo in 1952 when students are killed by the police. So first it is linguistic, then it becomes a broader case of culture, which then expands to the issue of economic disparity and ultimately takes the shape of independence. So this was the internal dynamics. And it has been my privilege to be a part of that process from 1967 onwards, particularly when I entered Dhaka University. Now, as some of you may know, the Dhaka University actually enjoys a disproportionate amount of importance in the political history of Bangladesh, because most of the things happened in that university campus. And it was my privilege to be a part of it. I joined the university in 1967. And at that time, 67 is the moment when Ayub Khan, in all his splendor and pomp, is at his height. So I enter university when he's at his height. And by the time I leave university, which was in 1973, actually a little late because our courses got delayed because of the war. So by the time I left university, Ayub had fallen. He was succeeded by Yahya, who had fallen, and Pakistan was dismantled. And here I was, a proud citizen of an independent country. It has been a very, if you like, dynamic few years, and thinking and being a part of it. I can tell you that when people move, when there's a desire by the people, nothing can stop it. And it is dramatized by the fact that Pakistan Army, which was one of the most well-equipped, trained by the Americans, equipped by the Americans for decades, just couldn't go do anything in the face of a totally people-centered movement.
And the crucial turning point, of course, was the election of 1970, which is the first election which the Awami League under Sheikh Mujibur Rahman actually won.
Ironically, it was the first election of Pakistan itself.
Correct.
Since its birth in 47, it never gave any election.
And that election, the verdict is not acceptable to the military leadership and to people like Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was, the sort of who got the most number of seats in West Pak, but wouldn't agree to sharing power.
Right. The peculiar result of this was that Sheikh Mujib was the overwhelming leader of East Pakistan. He got all but 2 seats in East Pakistan, but unfortunately he didn't get any in West. And Bhutto got, I think, 2/3 of the seats in West Pakistan. There were other parties there, but none from East. So that, in a way, created a split. But because of our majority number, Sheikh Mujib had enough seats in the combined parliament of Pakistan to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan. And in fact, the military general Yahya had declared that Sheikh Mujib will be the future Prime Minister of Pakistan. It is after that statement that the conspiracies began, particularly led by Bhutto, who just couldn't take the fact that somebody from East Pakistan will be the Prime Minister of Pakistan.
And Dhaka University was also the major site where the military crackdown begins on 26th of March.
Yes. Now, just to, in a way, give an atmospheric of the situation. So election is held. By the way, there was another very important election we shouldn't forget, the election in India, in which Indira Gandhi becomes the most powerful elected leader. Now, it is very important that if Indira Gandhi didn't have the mandate to lead her government as she did, India's involvement in Bangladesh may not have been so forthcoming, because here was she with a public mandate, with majority, I think 2/3 majority in the Indian parliament. So 2 elections, the election of Bangladesh in 70 and the election in India in 70. Now coming back, so Sheikh Mujib gets elected and he's declared as the future Prime Minister of Pakistan. And then suddenly on the 1st of March, Yahya declares that the parliament session cannot be held. It is indefinitely postponed. Now that triggers, I remember, the first protest started at the stadium where we were all watching a cricket game. And then the news came that the parliament session is postponed. And suddenly, can you imagine a stadium full of people suddenly stood up and said, no, and, Bangladesh, Joy Bangla and all that. And that started, then Sheikh Mujib declared a non-cooperation, non-violent, non-cooperation movement in the style of Mahatma Gandhi. His famous, absolutely historic speech on 7th of March, which, by the way, and I'm not just saying because I admire him as a leader, but it is really absolutely a fantastic speech in which he says everything, and yet he leaves something so that he's not legally accused of being a secessionist. It is inspirational. It is sort of a path showing. It gives us confidence, and all of these things combine. So 7th March, and then Sheikh Mujib declares the continuation of his non-cooperation movement. He says nobody is going to pay taxes to Pakistan. Nobody is going to work in offices. We are all going to wait for it, and in the meantime, government will have to pay the salaries. Blah blah blah. It was really almost like a taking over of running the place. And then, Yahya then proposes some discussion. There are people coming in. Bhutto comes to East Pakistan, discusses. But by then, the rumor was around that this discussion was a sham. And we were seeing, like, every night, literally uninterrupted flights coming in and coming out. Dhaka was a small city, so if plane landed, it could be heard, and planes at that time made more noise than they do now. So we knew that lots of flights were coming in, taking off at night. And then, of course, we sort of rumored that troops were being brought in, and ammunition and tanks were being brought in on PIA flights and all that. And then on the night of 25th March, early morning 26th, the genocide begins. And it starts with Dhaka University and the surrounding, if you like, slums over there. And then it's really a mayhem. Curfew was declared for 2 days. And then on 27th morning, I remember it was lifted for 2 hours. Where people could just find out. And I rushed to Dhaka University, and I went to some of these halls where the bodies were still lying around, and the bustis, there were bodies lying around. And that was the 27th March. Please.
And this time, of course, it's a very crucial time for the formulation of Indian policy as well, because India is getting information about it. Now, we know from archival records that Sheikh Mujib was actually in touch with Mrs. Indira Gandhi sometime the first week of March. In fact, before his historic speech of 7th March, he had sent an emissary to meet the Indian Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka to say that, listen, India should be prepared to assist us because we may have to go down the route of a struggle for liberation because this is not working out. But then over the next 2 weeks, the Indians are very confused because of this Yahya Khan's, as you say, the orchestrated charade of a talks which were going on. So at some level, the 26th March events do come as a surprise. But what to me was very striking when I was looking at it is that, Mrs. Indira Gandhi and her key decision makers, especially P.N. Huxer, who was her principal secretary at that point of time, they come to a very quick conclusion that India will have to open up its borders to people from East Pakistan, Bangladesh who will come in. We will have to afford whatever military, whatever logistical and other support that we can. But at the same time, we have to play our cards very carefully because the international community will be very hostile if it is seen that India is somehow supporting a struggle for independence and trying to break up Pakistan, because the India-Pakistan rivalry was always seen as a bipolar thing. So one of the things that Mrs. Gandhi is very clear from the beginning is to emphasize that this is not about India and Pakistan. This is about Bangladesh. Yes. This is about the people who have been suppressed. And so getting that message across in some ways is, requires an enormous diplomatic effort, which plays out over several months. But at the same time, the government of India also has to help people on the ground and so on. And one of the questions I had, so which you may be able to answer is, I always felt that many of the histories which are written especially of this early, period between April and say September, October, don't quite emphasize the at least to my mind, very important role played by Tajuudeen, because he was the one who held the provisional government in exile together and managed so many contradictions.
Absolutely, you are so very right. You see, Sheikh Mujib, whom we lovingly call Bangabandhu, he, I think, he is arrested by the Pakistani military and transported to West Pakistan. But his leadership is absolutely, undeniable and absolutely strongly present in all of us. But to put it all together, it was really the credit of Tajuudeen and some other senior leaders of Awami League, like Mr. Nazrul Islam, particularly Nazrul Islam, who was the acting president. Now, Tajuudeen's, there are very interesting, personal stories about how Tajuudeen crossed over to India and then somehow went to Delhi and wanted an appointment with Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and had to sort of go through some channels, because actually Tajuudeen was not very well known. It was all about Sheikh Mujib. In fact, many people hadn't even seen many of his photographs. But as you may recall, that there was a government in exile formed on the 17th of April, in which Bangabandhu was declared the president, and in his absence, acting president was Nazrul Islam, and the prime minister of the exiled government was Tajuudeen. And it was his, dexterity, his management to carry on, because Bengalis are not a very disciplined lot, and everybody wants to be a leader. Sheikh Mujib was there, but since he's in Pakistan, there were internal, I think, pulls and pushes, and Tajuudeen managed it brilliantly. first of all, to bring together the forces within Bangladesh and then liaise firstly with Indian government and with the international community to sort of get the focus on Bangladesh.
Absolutely. And I think even with India, I mean, for instance, Tajuudeen had to be extremely patient because the government of India, as you know, was not willing to recognize the provisional government of Bangladesh. They said that, we will wait till the time is correct and then we will.
I think there I side with the Indian government that the timing they chose I think was perfect, but there was no doubt about the commitment of Indian government on the side. Now I was a Mukti Bahini, so I can tell you the story from the camps, but I had also been I had an assignment by the government in exile, so I visited Calcutta. At that time, I can tell you the way the people of Calcutta, now Kolkata, actually opened their hearts for the Bangladeshis. I mean, there were the camps, in Salt Lake City, huge camp, and in the border areas. But even in Kolkata itself, I mean, there were many refugee families staying in, just a corner of a building, which the residents of the building, not necessarily private house, but like a colony type of a building, and they allowed families to stay. I mean, it was absolutely, I would say, a people to people contact, a people's commitment to our cause, which is unparalleled. And also, I would like to emphasize Mrs. Indira Gandhi's role. I personally think that she did a magnificent job of mobilizing. First of all, she had to mobilize her own country, the Indians together, and there are so many Muslims in India. They had to be sort of brought into the picture. India is a vast country, and to prepare it to go into a possibility of a war, it requires tremendous amount of leadership. And then Indira Gandhi's role abroad to mobilize the world opinion. Now, as you just mentioned, it was at the height of the Cold War politics. And I remember that day when you mentioned about the rapprochement between US and China. I was sitting in an open field and reading Amrita Bajar Putrika, which no longer exists. And there was an 8-column heading, Kissinger in Beijing. At that time, it was called Peking, and the whole world was surprised. As you know, he flew from Peshawar in Pakistan, and suddenly Kissinger had disappeared for 3-4 days from global focus, and he emerges in China. And it was, of course, a big shock for us because China, as you remember, was siding with Pakistan and as such was opposed to us. So Mrs. Gandhi had to play a very dexterous, I would say, a magnificent role. And I particularly recall her tour abroad. I think it was in the middle of the year that she visited some of the very powerful countries, trying to sort of explain to them what was going on here. So she did her homework, she did her legwork, if you like, and then the signing of Indo-Soviet Treaty, which was again, in a way, a non-aligned India, a very famous policy formulator and the leader of the non-aligned group, suddenly signing a treaty with one of the superpowers. So all these, if you like, if you take these postures and positioning and like a chessboard move, that ultimately led to the December direct war with Pakistan and our liberation. I think we owe Bangladesh and we Bengalis owe a lot to Mrs. Gandhi for her role at that time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the management of the external dimension was critical because otherwise, things could have gone, and the timing of that was absolutely right. Because, as you said, Nixon was already very favorably disposed towards Yahya, and generally the Pakistani sort of military. Later on, he tells very explicitly that we should not put any pressure. He in fact says, "Don't squeeze Yahya." That famous document already, and underlines it and so on. And then post the rapprochement with China, there is a sense that, in order to keep our relationship with China, we have to keep supporting Pakistan so that the Chinese continue to think that we will be reliable allies and so on. So there's a larger geopolitical calculus which comes in. But even on the Indo-Soviet side, what's very interesting is that you're absolutely right. The Indo-Soviet Treaty is signed in August, and that's the thing. But even after the evening after the Indo-Soviet treaty is signed, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister who is there to sign the treaty, and now we have the records, he speaks to Mrs. Gandhi and he tells her that, you must proceed very carefully. He says that in Russian, we have a proverb which says that, the heart must be warm, but the head must be cool. So he says, our advice to you will be not to move very impetuously. In fact, it's Mrs. Gandhi's trip, which you rightly mentioned, in October, when she goes to Moscow. That is the time when she meets the troika of Leonid Brezhnev, Podgorny, and Alexei Kosygin, and convinces all three of them that this is a liberation struggle. This is not a revolt by some kind of bourgeois forces, etc., as the Soviets in their own Marxist analysis were perhaps thinking, and that this has to be done. And in fact, it was a 5-hour-long marathon meeting in which she manages to convince them. And that support was crucial, as you say, because without the Soviet vetoes, it's difficult to conceive of how the Indian military could have, even had the window that it had in order to help Bangladesh liberate itself.
And Pakistan was making a very, very strong case that it is an Indian ploy to break Pakistan. Then there's nothing going on in East Pakistan. So these are the sensitivities, and if you think of the global context in which it is the Cold War is very hot, the ideological camps are very divided, and in that sort of a very, if you like, suspicious moment for India to really help us in the way they did, which could easily be seen by other countries, and Pakistan did see it like that, and I think China too, that this is nothing but India's ploy. So it could have conflagrated into something bigger. And if you remember, Vietnam was very hot at that time. There were lots of troops, American troops in Vietnam. This is 71. And hundreds and thousands of American troops are in Vietnam. So for anything to go wrong, and once in an international, if you like, relations, once anything goes wrong, it is very difficult to sort of go back and recreate it. So the maturity, the foresight, the patience, the cleverness, and the determination with which Mrs. Gandhi led the whole thing is really a unique example in history.
Since now we're looking back 50 years from 1971, maybe we should talk a little bit about the aftermath of 1971, because the war and the crisis, as we discussed, was managed very successfully and so on. And Sheikh Mujib's Bangabandhu's arrival in January 1972 was a very historic moment, right? And then, of course, Bangladesh sets down to create a constitution, which I think was the most progressive constitution anywhere in the third world at that point of time, not including India.
We took the best from whatever was there in the world.
Exactly. So this is a political project which is filled with great degree of hope. But of course, there is international isolation because the UN does not recognize Bangladesh till 1974. Pakistan gets China to exercise a veto. But nevertheless, things start unraveling very soon within Bangladesh itself. And I was just wondering, do you think it has got something to do with the conditions under which the liberation war itself happened? Figures like Ziaur Rahman, of course, we know took part in the liberation struggle, but there were different factions even within the sort of the Bangladesh Liberation Front, so to speak. And I'm just wondering, how do we trace the trajectory from this very decisive moment of arrival of Bangladesh as a confident, independent country to one where Bangabandhu himself is assassinated and things just take a downward turn?
Well, this is really, again, just as dramatic the birth of Bangladesh, so is it tragic, the assassination. But I think the enemies of Bangladesh, you see, after all, as I said, we had first partitioned in 47 and then became independent in 71. The remnants of the forces that actually wanted a united Pakistan, wanted a Muslim East Pakistan, because mind you, Bangladesh Liberation War was founded on the idea of nationalism. So, but there were disgruntled forces within. Now, and they realized that one of the reasons that Mujib had to be killed was because he was so popular. There was no way of anyway through mass movement or through popular uprising to push Mujib to one side. So those who wanted a hit back knew that the only way to go about it is to kill him. And killing is conspiratorial. Killing is a factor of chance and sort of decisions, which was actually, in a way, ironically, the other side of it was that Mujib was truly a people's person. He didn't believe in security as such. So can you imagine that a newly created country, and it is quite conceivable that once you become independent, there are fissures here and there. There are, conspirators. After all, it's a country of 75 million at that time. But Mujib just wouldn't think of it. He continued to live in his private house in Dhanbandi. He didn't move to the prime ministerial house or the presidential, house, which are far more, secure and protected. He lived in his house. Like I used to live in my father's house, which was in Dhanbandi too. So it was like a private house. There were some policemen here and there, and he refused to sort of take any security. He said that I am the father of the nation. People love me. How can I become like old rulers? So that also helped, because if he was in a secure location, these things wouldn't have happened. So it was very tragic, and the loss of him as a person, his leadership, the ideals definitely got a huge setback. Idea of secularism, democracy, and all that. But what it also started off is the military's involvement in politics. This is precisely what we were opposed to, precisely why we broke away from Pakistan. So in a way, the military takeover was like a recreation of a Pakistani form of governance in Bangladesh. So the military came in and they stayed in power from 1975 to 1991, 21 years. Am I right? No,
16 years.
16 years. 16 years they were in power, continuous power, and they distorted many things. They distorted our constitution, they distorted the way of doing politics, they distorted the way of holding elections. So you can say that and we are born in 71, we get totally derailed in 75, and in 1991, through a people's uprising and the fall of Ershad, who is the second military dictator, we come back on track. So in 1991, we call that event restoration of democracy. So 1991, we come back on track. But then we have a separate set of problems, which is the emergence of two very powerful political parties. One, of course, Sheikh Mujib's party, Awami League, led by his daughter, and another party formed by General Zia Rahman called Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by his wife. So on the face of it, it was an ideal two-party parliamentary democratic system, which is very good, because many of the parliamentary democracies suffer from factionalism and many small parties, coalition government. In our case, it was very clear. Awami League and BNP, strong two parties. So we thought these two parties will get into a parliamentary form of a structure, and one rule another opposition, and sort of a healthy Westminster style. You have two parties in the US, you have two major parties in UK, and at that time two major parties in India. So we will also have a good two-party parliamentary democratic system. Unfortunately, the rivalry of our two parties were so intense, because Sheikh Hasina believed that the founder of BNP, Zia Rahman, had something to do with her father's killing. And it was not only her father, it is the whole family. The viciousness of the assassination is absolutely unparalleled. So that suspicion remained. But still, we had some sort of semblance of democratic politics. And because of the caretaker government system, which was actually introduced at the insistence of Awami League, we had a situation where every new election brought in the other party. So we have had BNP first, Awami League second, then BNP coming second time, then Awami League coming second time. But this, however, sort of looks democratic, but it created an intense political rivalry. And unfortunately, in 2004, an attempt is made on Hasina's life.
Correct.
And this, there are enough reasons for us to believe, and I, as an editor, would say that the narrative is murky. And BNP was in power at that time. And the BNP's lack of sincerity in finding out who the culprits were, in a way, makes them accessory after the fact, if you like, because that's how it looks. So that sowed a further suspicion in Hasina's mind that her husband killed my family, my father, and now she wants to kill me. Now, that to me, in my view, totally destroyed any semblance or any possibility of this two-party system working.
And of course, once Sheikh Hasina comes back to power, certainly from 2010 onwards, she's very keen to reclaim the mantle of the liberation war. So in a sense, the liberation war's history once again comes back into contemporary Bangladesh. Right? Because the war crimes trials are launched at that point of time.
Yes.
And in fact, Sheikh Mujib himself wanted to carry out the war crimes trials, and that process had begun in 1972.
Right.
And the list of people was identified, evidence was collected against them. But of course, then his assassination happened, so the entire process got derailed. But Sheikh Hasina then takes this process over, and in a somewhat more overtly contemporary political tones as well. But it has a lot of support from the people.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, how do you read that moment, and from there this turn towards a much more, a stronger kind of, authoritarian turn which her party seems to take.
Now, the biggest credit that I give to Sheikh Hasina is that she brought the liberation war narrative into the center stage, which the killers of Sheikh Mujib and the military dictators wanted really to put in the back burner. So as a freedom fighter, I feel very, very supportive of her action. The liberation war narrative is the center stage. The values are again very much strong, and democracy, secularism, things are very much there. However, I think then Sheikh Hasina's own, if you like, myopia and her own sense of not giving up power or being the leader who has to save the country, quote unquote, has pushed her into an authoritarian streak. Now, we have had two elections after she assumed power in 2009. We have had an election in 2014 and another in 2019. Now, both these elections have a lot to be desired for. And the mechanism through which these elections were held is far from giving it even a semblance of credibility. So now we have a situation where, on the other side, there has been a narrative of tremendous economic success. I mean, Bangladesh surprised the world, surprised everybody that we can be such a strong economic power. So that has given us a new sense of self-confidence, new sense of pride. And Hasina, Prime Minister Hasina, has a lot to do with it. This, if you like, continuous 13, 14 years of her rule, which are in many ways despotic and authoritarian, also, on the contrary side, led to a period of stability, which then helped the private sector to really emerge. So now we have a narrative, and if I put it journalistically, where our development curve is on the way up, but our democracy curve is on the way down.
which of course it's a historic irony of some kind, right? Because when Bangladesh became independent in 1972, and gave itself this very progressive democratic constitution.
Right.
At that time, Bangladesh was dismissed by none less than Henry Kissinger as a basket case, economic basket case, as a country which could never kind of come out of poverty, etc.
Right.
And I think Bangladesh has proven that verdict quite decisively wrong. But as you're saying, perhaps there is a question mark on some of the other things. But I was just, when I look back as a historian at the events of 1971, I'm struck by two things. So one, of course, is that, purely as an event of its time in 1971, it just seems to me that that particular crisis captured so many aspects of the world in which we now live. I mean, you saw similar crises playing out in Yugoslavia, various kinds of humanitarian sort of crises which happened in the 1990s after the Cold War. So in some ways, Bangladesh really and its emergence was a harbinger of literally the world to come. And so in that sense, I still think that maybe 50 years down the line, when historians have even more distance, they will see this as a very, very pivotal moment in the 20th century, not just from the perspective of Bangladesh or South Asia, but I think from global history as well. But at the same time, as an Indian, when I look back at that time and now, it just strikes me that, there's an old saying by Hartley that the past is a foreign country. And I think it does seem very foreign, because I was very amused to note that, in 1971, when Bangladesh became independent, and Mrs. Gandhi had made that famous speech saying that Dhaka is the capital of a free country.
Yes.
The press was awash with commentary about how the two-nation theory, on the basis of which India and Pakistan had been created, partition happened, had been decisively put to rest. Because the idea that religion alone could be a glue which binds the people together, and this idea of an ethno-religious nationalism was in some ways decisively defeated. And the people of Bangladesh had shown that that was not true. And to me, it is a historic irony that in some ways it is that ideology perhaps rules the roost in India, where a form of ethno-religious nationalism is very much on the ascendant. And I dare say it's not just in India, but all of South Asia, where the older models of nationalism, with its kind of more progressive secular outlook, with a degree of embrace of modernity, perhaps, is now increasingly under question. And perhaps as a last thought, I'd like your reflections on this.
Yeah, I'm 72 years old, and I've been a journalist for quite a long time. And this paper is 30 years old, which I co-founded. So I am able to take a longer view of the region. And I personally feel very strongly, I'm a very proud Bangladeshi, but in my pride Bangladeshi mindset, I strongly believe that a collaborative relationship with India and a cooperative relationship with India is good for Bangladesh. This is, I feel, as a proud Bangladeshi. Now, having said that, I see now quite a different India than the India of 71. Now, if you look at the map, now here is Bangladesh. On one side is Myanmar, which is going into Buddhist extremism. Rohingyas are victimized not only because of their ethnicity, but also because of their religion. There are other ethnic groups in Myanmar who are not being thrown out of the country. They happen to be the only Muslim ethnic groups. And the rise of extreme Buddhist monks in Myanmar who are supporting the military. So we have rising Buddhism on one side and rising Hinduism on the other. And there I am sitting in the middle talking about secularism with a stream of religious fundamentalists also in our midst. This I see as a very serious challenge to Bangladesh. I cannot think of a stable South Asia without solid cooperation between all South Asian countries, but especially between India and Bangladesh. Now, with India going Hindu, and believe me, the current election which is going on in West Bengal, which, if you like, like it's a room with a partition and you can hear what is being said in the other room. And the anti-Bangladeshi rhetoric which Mr. Amit Shah has used and BJP is using. Now, this has created a lot of ripples in Bangladesh. So India's future ideological stance, how much of it will be secular, how much of it will be democratic, and how much of it will be religious, will have an impact on Bangladesh. This worries me. And also, there are other factors which are challenging Bangladesh. One is the climate change issue. Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries on the climate change agenda. Then again, we have also, the resource constraints. We have done well, but we need to do much better. The management of this huge population of 100 and now almost 70 million in this small country. So with climate change, putting pressure on. So I believe population, resource scarcity, management of human resource, and setting up of some sort of an accountable government. It may not be that democratic. I mean, democracy is taking a back seat in many parts of the world. But even in the most authoritarian regimes like China, you have an accountability system in which Chinese Communist Party leaderships are being thrown out of the party every now and then for corruption. The absence of an accountability governance structure worries me. So collectively speaking, I see very serious challenges in the coming days for Bangladesh.
Thank you,
And
sir.
for India, if I may add.
Yeah, of course. Sia, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Raghavan and Mr. Anam, for this most excellent and informative talk. We have had questions streaming in throughout the past half hour or so on Zoom and YouTube. I will address them to you one after the other. In some cases, I may just combine the questions. The first is from Imtiaz Hussain. On India's domestic front, has there been any kind of national conversation inside India between national or provincial leaders and the public on Bangladesh? The question stems from the vast difference between the open arms public leadership receipt of Bangladeshis in 1971 to the more reserved / hostile public attitudes in contrast to the warm leadership relations towards Bangladesh today. And he adds a second question. Ultimately, is Bangladesh's importance in New Delhi purely for strategic reasons or to cultivate long-term cross-border social relations?
So, I think as Mr. Anam pointed out, it is very much India's desire to have a stable relationship with Bangladesh. And in fact, I would say that if you look at the record of the Narendra Modi government over the last now 7 years, almost in power, you would see that actually the relationship with Bangladesh is perhaps been the most stable relationship within the subcontinent. It's the one which has not had much ups and downs. But the problem is that that foreign policy is now getting caught up in the domestic political priorities of the ruling party itself and what it wants to do, really in terms of its ambitions for expansion and consolidation of its power in East and Northeast India, which has led to this not just rhetoric against Bangladeshis, but also activities like the Citizenship Amendment Act, the move towards a national register for citizens, all of which is bound to create much more uncertainty and turbulence in the area. So I entirely agree with Mr. Anam, and the questioner also that this contradiction is going to be something that we'll have to face up at some point. We cannot behave as if on the right hand can do foreign policy, which is friendly, while the left hand does domestic politics, which is antagonistic. And if there is any lesson to be learned from 1971, political leadership plays a very important role in setting the tenor of how people perceive a certain situation. At that point, as Mr. Anam also pointed out, Mrs. Indira Gandhi and her government gave a very positive leadership. Instead of suggesting that the 10 million people who came from Bangladesh to India were somehow aliens who had infiltrated our territory, we said that these were people who were fighting for their liberation and that we have to support them. But she also insisted that they will have to go back, but only when conditions are suitable for them. So I think that's the kind of leadership which can make a difference.
If I may add 2 bits here, that actually I personally think that democracy has some flaws within it. Now, if you are totally focused on a calculation of how many voters belong to what ethnicity and what religion and what cultural background, and what are the slogans that I'm going to propose, which is going to tickle the minds of the majority, which I calculate in a sort of a matrix, and then push those slogans just so that I get more votes. This is quite possible in democracy, but this is not visionary. We sometimes, that term Pyrrhic victory, that your victory is as costly as the defeat, that you can win an election, but you leave such hatred and suspicion in the mind of the voters that what you have voted to govern has become weakened. Now, I see this happening, in our parts of the world, that to just cater to a vote bank, you you release in the public domain slogans that instead of uniting, divide, instead of harmonizing, create suspicion. And you have won the election, but you have destroyed the electorate. Now, that is something that we must seriously need to look into. I mean, please, we keep on talking that South Asia has the potential of being the greatest economic zone of the world. It has such huge educated manpower, cultural diversity, music, dance, literature. You say it and we have it. And yet, what is the history of last 70 years? I mean, from 1947. Poverty, how much have we tackled? How much really have we made progress in the global scale? So I really urge Indian citizens, and as I do my own citizens, that we must take a bigger vision of our region. This myopic politics and calculating on the basis of ethnicity and religion and this and that, this is too short term a way to look at things.
The next question is from Neil Nagwekar. The question is to Mr. Anam. Could you name some Bengali Muslims at the forefront of both partitions? Could the same people make/unmake the legitimization of Pakistan when there was a 23-year gap between both events?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest Muslim leader is Maulana Azad, who was the president of Congress. I really didn't get the thrust of your question, what you actually meant.
So I think he was trying to ask about, you had mentioned this point saying that the same group of people who made Pakistan also unmade it between 47 and 71, and whether there were any Muslim political leaders whom you can point to as being at the forefront of both of these. I'd imagine Bangabandhu himself is one of those. So.
No, Bangabandhu was a very young person at that time. If you name, then the leaders would be Hossein Shahid Sarwardi, A.K. Fazlul Haq, and Maulana Bhashani. They were very much in the forefront of elections, a struggle for Pakistan, and subsequently also the struggle for secular East Pakistan. Awami League was formed in 1948 within a year of birth of Pakistan. And these three leaders, Sarwardi, Bhashani, and not Fazlul Haq at that time, but Sarwardi, Bhashani had come together to form the Awami League.
Priyan R. Nayak asks, and the question, there are two questions. The first is, the student movement and the focus on the national language were the actual precursors to the 1971 events. When and how did Bangladesh's splendid focus on economic performance and GDP growth that Bangladesh is demonstrating year after year germinate in Bangladeshi minds? The second question is, you talked about visiting Calcutta as a Mukti Bahini member in the 70s when Calcutta and Dhaka were almost similar as cities. How has Dhaka grown into such a lovely capital with gorgeous enclaves, elaborate roads, and lovely parks? What do you feel about the two cities now?
Well, let's not be unfair to Kolkata. It has grown too. And there are some nice places to visit. And we from Dhaka often visit Kolkata and like it. Not to speak about the saris of Kolkata. But no, the student movement, you are absolutely right in saying that the language movement and the student movement were the precursors. And it is absolutely, I think, one of the most brilliant phases of our student politics, what the students did in the Pakistan period from 1948 onwards till 71. They were in the forefront, and on many instances, they pushed the politicians towards a more stronger anti-Ayub position, anti-Yahya position, driving the political leaders to come together on various platforms. So this is really a brilliant phase of student politics. And at what time this Bangladesh mindset, I think, we had a if you like, a period of depression after Bangabandhu's murder and the militarization of our politics, that this is not what we dreamt about in 71. So once we got a chance, particularly from 1991 with the restoration of democracy, the private sector in Bangladesh grew. Another, if you like, very attractive story about Bangladesh is the role of the NGOs. If you start off with the Grameen Bank and the microcredit idea, which is now accepted globally, has done wonders. Then you take BRAC, first is Grameen Bank, then another is BRAC, which is the biggest NGO in the world. They had formulated a model of primary education, which is now replicated in 43 countries outside Bangladesh. Then, on human rights, particularly on women's rights, organizations dealing with women's rights, health of the poor. So the NGOs played a very good role. The private sector did. Our farmers. Now, in 1971, Bangladesh had a population of 75 million, and we had famines. Now we are a country of 160 or plus million, and we are self-sufficient in food. I mean, the agriculturists, the farmers did a miraculous job, obviously with help, with a positive policy from the governments of subsidy in fertilizer and other things. So I would say that Bangladesh really turned around under the leadership, obviously political leadership, and Sheikh Hasina deserves a lot of credit for it. The private sector, the farmers, agriculturists, NGOs, and civic society, all of them really came together in a magnificent, unified sort of a flow to change Bangladesh's fortune.
Bhavani RV asks, in the current political context that you referred to, do you see hope for initiatives like SARC? Can we hope for cooperative relationship in the region, given that we share so much in common?
Who should we go first?
No, please go ahead. Please go.
Okay, now SARC is an excellent idea, but it has not worked. Two rivalries have actually destroyed our prosperity or prospect for the future. One is Pakistan-India relationship. I mean, everybody talks about how fruitless it is, but everybody adds more and more military power on either side. It has served nothing to Pakistan, in fact, destroyed Pakistan. I once told a Pakistani High Commissioner that the money you spent in fighting or supporting the Kashmiris in India, if you had spent 100th of that money for East Pakistan, then situation, the history might, the development could have been different. But so Pakistan-India rivalry has been very destructive. Another rivalry now worries me very much is India-China rivalry. Obviously there are issues, but and both of these countries are enormously powerful, hugely resource enriched, and you could go on fighting for years together. But I don't think it will help anybody. It will neither help India nor China. But the tension is on the rise, and what is fearful for countries like us is that both China and India will try to draw us in their camps, which is not good for Bangladesh. Bangladesh needs a very good relationship with India, so does it needs a relationship with China, and we don't see any contradiction in having good relationship both these countries. But if the situation becomes even dire and the if you like, the configuration is that you have to be on either this or that, it's not going to be healthy. So SARC has not worked because of India-Pakistan rivalry, and the future, I think, to a large extent, is going to be affected by India-China rivalry, unless a vision and a wide sort of wide vision intercedes and takes both countries to a more wiser path.
Professor Raghavan, would you like to add to that?
No. I mean, I think I agree with practically everything.
So there are a couple of questions from Mariam Khan. Please, could you elaborate on the relationship between Mujib and Tajuddin during the political negotiations of Jan to March 1971? There is a prominent thesis in the literature that Mujib continued to be invested in United Pakistan, but was hemmed in by hardliners like Tajuddin after the election to take a rigid stance on the 6 points, thus raising the stakes for the military. What are your thoughts on this? And the second question is, it would be very helpful if you could unpack the relationship between Bhutto and the regime a bit more. There is a virtual unanimity in nationalist accounts of the founding of Bangladesh that Bhutto was singularly responsible for the constitutional breakdown of 1971. Allegations of Bhutto junta collusion aside, what is your thinking on the role of the regime and Yahya in creating and fueling the conditions of March 1971? After all, Bhutto had no authority or power of his own to thwart a transfer of power to the Awami League.
Well, it's a very complex question. A lot of interactions and factors play here. But first of all, the relationship between Tajuddin and Sheikh Mujib, I see it as something comparable as a relationship between Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. The way one was the public face, the great theoretician, the energizer, the mass, unifier. So was Sheikh Mujib here on our side. And Tajuddin was the worker behind the scene. From 1948 onwards, Tajuddin and Sheikh Mujib, particularly from the 50s, they formed almost like the two sides of a coin. They worked relentlessly together. They were very intimate, trusted each other, respected each other. Mujib was the public face. Mujib was the great orator and the public mobilizer. And Tajuddin was the not secret, but the man behind the scene doing the work that Mujib wanted to do, organizing party groups, fixing leadership in that district committee, that union committee, taking care of the nitty-gritty and they made an excellent partner. And this continued. And during the Liberation War, Tajuddin was the most loyal follower of Bangabandhu, but he had to give the leadership, which was the call of the time. But after liberation, there were factions who tried to say Tajuddin took too much credit and didn't give enough to Bangabandhu, but there are no historical facts to support it. But when Bangabandhu returned, there is a clear instance where Tajuddin is actually not forced, but Tajuddin feels comfortable to resign from Bangabandhu's cabinet. That was a very tragic parting. And why it actually happened is, if you like, still a part of research. But there were policy differences, and Tajuddin left. And I think that split, if you call it, between Tajuddin and Sheikh Mujib was a very crucial factor in weakening the post-liberation Bangladesh government. So, and coming to Bhutto's singular role, you see, I mean, military Yahya regime, we can say many things about it. But one thing that has to be said, the military regime gave a free and fair election in 1970. I mean, in Pakistan after 47 had no general election. So Yahya could have not given another election for another 5 years. There would have been obviously political agitation, a lot of violence and all that, but still there would not have been any election. Yahya gave the election and truly not interfered. That brought Sheikh Mujib to the forefront through an electoral victory. So, and he declared that Pakistan's next prime minister is Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Then who throws a spanner in that whole process? Now, obviously, Bhutto had links with Pakistani generals, and they might have conspired. But as of public posturing or as of public statement, the transfer of power was all there to happen with the convening of the parliament. So Bhutto, in a sense, if not singularly, but definitely shares a bigger burden of responsibility for the genocide of 26 March than any other single leader.
The only point I'll add is that, I don't think it's quite correct to say that Bhutto was in no position to thwart a transfer of power. Actually, he was, because he had won, his party had won, the PPP had won the majority of seats. And the way that Bhutto was positioning himself vis-a-vis the military, with whom he had actually a bit of a complicated relationship, because he had walked out of the Ayub Khan government. So the military is not entirely trustful. But at that point of time, there is a convergence of interests in a sense of saying, should West Pakistan have the upper hand or not? And there is agreement that we have to keep the Bengalis down, and if necessary, form a national unity cabinet. That is what Bhutto was pushing for. He said, till such time there is agreement on the constitution, we should not convene the assembly. So there were many ways in which he did kind of, if not exactly wield the veto, did have a fairly strong hand to play after the election. So I don't think he was a sort of a lone actor out there.
Thank you. That's all that we have time for today. We have had many more questions. And thank you so much for sharing so much of your time and your thoughts. Professor Srinath Reddy and Mr. Mahfuz Anam, thank you both so much for that insightful and thought-provoking discussion on the history which is shared by the two nations, Bangladesh and India. All the colleagues at Orient Black Swan who have been involved in today's event before and behind the scenes, thank you. To all the members of the audience who have joined us today, and to those of you watching us live on YouTube, a very big thank you. We do hope you have enjoyed today's discussion. Those who registered but could not attend can always watch it on YouTube, where all our earlier discussions are also archived. Thank you once again for joining us. Wish you all a very pleasant evening. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.